We knew Canada's SNC-Lavalin controversy was making headlines around the world. Now it's grabbed the attention of a major intergovernmental body, of which Canada is one of 36 member countries. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Working Group on Bribery says it is concerned by allegations that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's office interfered in the SNC-Lavalin criminal case. And the CBC's Katie Simpson is here with those details. Hi, Katie.
Hi.
So what do they say about what they're concerned about specifically?
Well, we should put this in context first, that this matters because the Canadian government, specifically Justin Trudeau, has made a really big deal of standing up for multinational institutions, multilateral institutions at a time when places like the United States have sort of taken a step back from the traditional role as sort of leader of the free world. And in order to protect institutions like the OECD, Canada has been very strongly in support of groups like this. Today, the OECD put out a statement saying it is concerned about what's going on in Canada with the SNC-Lavalin affair. We have part of that statement. We'll bring it up right now. It said the OECD Working Group on Bribery is concerned by recent allegations of interference in the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin. As a party to the Anti-Bribery Convention, Canada is fully committed to complying with the convention, which requires prosecutorial independence in foreign bribery cases. The working group recognizes Canada's willingness to keep it fully informed of developments in the proceedings, including at its next meeting in June of 2019. So we reached out to the Prime Minister's office today to get some sort of response to this, because this is not good news for the Prime Minister. It's not good news for the Canadian government. We got a statement back from Chrystia Freeland's press secretary instead, and it says, we will continue to work with and update the working group on the robust and independent domestic processes currently underway in Canada, which the working group has recognized and encouraged. What that means is that the Chrystia Freeland's office is pointing to those two investigations that are underway into what's going on. One by the Justice Committee, which meets again on Wednesday. The other by the Ethics Commissioner. As you know, though, the opposition has been calling on, the NDP is calling for a full public inquiry. The Conservatives are calling for the RCMP to investigate. Both parties are calling for a broader scope at the Justice Committee as well. And on Wednesday, when they meet, they will discuss whether Jody Wilson-Raybould should be given full latitude to discuss the entire matters to waive all confidence cabinet rules.
And we know that this has garnered, obviously, from your reporting, what the international group, the OECD, is saying about it. What's the latest on what's happening here at home with this story?
Well, over the weekend, there was a story by the Globe and Mail about an Ontario Liberal MP who says she's experienced hostility with the Prime Minister. And it's sort of in the wake of everything that's unfolded with the SNC-Lavalin affair. As viewers will know, Jody Wilson-Raybould left cabinet over this affair. Jane Philpott left cabinet over this affair. And when the Prime Minister defended himself, he used some language to say that he was working to make sure that he's approachable by all members of caucus, and that he's working to ensure that people are not afraid to approach him. Selina Caesar-Chavannes, who is an MP from Ontario, a Liberal MP from Ontario, she took issue with the Prime Minister's words on Twitter and then spoke to the Globe and Mail to express what she described, what she says was hostile actions with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's office has denied that. Over the weekend, we saw a number of Liberal MPs, specifically women, offering messages of support from social media. And there were two messages that were nearly identical. One from Anita Vandenbeld, who is an Ontario MP from the Ottawa area, and another from an MP named Linda Lapointe. She's a Quebec MP for the Liberals. They were nearly identical. So we reached out to both. Anita Vandenbeld got back to us first. She denies there was any sort of coordination here. She says that she suggested in our interview that perhaps her colleague, Ms. Lapointe, had copied her message, and she thought perhaps she should change it up because people will misconstrue that this is some sort of coordinated effort. She denies that and says she was simply showing her support for the Prime Minister at this time.
Even my poor staff didn't know I was going to tweet this. So I was just, honestly, I was reading the news in the morning and very concerned that there was an erroneous image of the Prime Minister being put out there, that the pundits were trying to put out an image of somebody who doesn't listen to women. And I find, in my experience, that is absolutely the opposite.
I asked her if she believed Selina Caesar-Chavannes and her story that was published in the Globe, and she said, I'm not here to discuss anyone else's experience. I'm only here to talk about what I've experienced.
All right, thank you so much, Katie. The CBC's Katie Simpson. So does the OECD have valid concerns? And how does Canada compare to other countries that are fighting bribery and corruption? Elizabeth Acorn is a Mars Brothers postdoctoral fellow at Yale University, and she joins me by Skype from New Haven, Connecticut. Hi, Ms. Acorn. Nice to see you. Thank you for your time.
Hi, thanks for having me today.
So the OECD released a statement today acknowledging the SNC, the working group on bribery, acknowledging what's going on in this country with the SNC-Lavalin controversy. They said they were concerned by the recent allegations and that they will be keeping a close eye on how everything proceeds. What do you think they'll be watching for?
I think over time they'll be watching for additional statements from the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office as to what was motivating any conversations they were having with the former Attorney General, as well as any ongoing considerations or discussions that are going on about potential decisions about negotiating a remediation agreement. I think what the OECD is really concerned about is potential justifications that the government might be offering for why a remediation agreement might be a possibility here. The OECD's concern is really, is it an impermissible consideration that would be guiding the government here? The OECD is interested in making sure that national economic interests and the identity of the party are not what determines enforcement decisions when it comes to foreign bribery.
Can you help us understand that a bit better? Because, I mean, there has been a sort of sub-debate going on here about what you can and can't take into account when pursuing a remediation agreement. And that phrase, national economic interest, is in the law, but there are different interpretations of what that means. So when you're saying the OECD wants to make sure impermissible considerations are not a factor here, what do you mean specifically?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting situation right now that we have sort of two levels of concerns over political interference. You know, the one within Canadian politics as to whether or not pressure was put on the Attorney General that would have protected sort of the sanctity of her role as the lead prosecutor. But then this one that also stems from the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which is what is at the root of Canada's anti-foreign bribery law. And, you know, thinking about the reason this convention exists, I think gives a lot of color to why national economic interests shouldn't be considered. This convention came up in the late 1990s as an effort of international cooperation to have countries sort of disarm mutually and all agree together to prohibit foreign bribery. And the only way that this could work would be that if all countries undertook the obligation to not allow their companies to engage in bribery abroad, thus leveling the playing field in international business. But on the same token, if this is to work going forward, enforcement has to also be applied in a way that will ensure this level playing field. If enforcement doesn't happen in order to protect firms that are important to a country, this is going to make sure the playing field remains uneven. So that's really the source of the concern of national economic interests in the OECD Convention, and we see that carry forward into the new provisions in the criminal code that govern remediation agreements and would be applicable to any enforcement action concerning foreign bribery.
What's your interpretation of national economic interest, though? Does it mean the potential loss, the concern over the loss of jobs? Does it mean our national interest compared to another country's economic interest? How do you interpret it?
Well, so the convention doesn't say. It specifically uses just the phrase national economic interest. But I think, you know, commentary to the convention and, you know, the academic scholarship on it suggests that, at least from the OECD's perspective, it's taken quite broadly. You know, there's a good example, I think, on point here from the United Kingdom. They had a situation in around 2006 where a prosecution against British Aerospace was discontinued. It was also a foreign bribery case, and while the UK prosecutors emphasized heavily the security concerns that drove their decision-making, there were public statements made by politicians in the United Kingdom that emphasized the important impact that such a prosecution would have on jobs in the United Kingdom. So I think in that situation, from the OECD's perspective, that was the kind of thing that would not have been appropriate under the Article 5 convention considerations that are prohibited.
And you have written about the use of remediation agreements and how it can be a tool for enforcement, considering especially that in the past, the OECD has criticized Canada for its enforcement of bribery laws. Can the political controversy that right now is sort of overshadowing the actual logistics of a DPA, do you think it can sort of color that potential positive use?
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a great point there, right? That in this particular consideration, there's not only a worry that national economic interests might be interfering with Canada's international obligations, but it might also interfere with the very logic behind creating these remediation agreements in the first place. I think Canada is very much to be commended for the diligence it undertook in creating remediation agreements in a way that could sort of harness their potential while minimizing some of the criticism. There's a very careful description of the considerations in the criminal code that a prosecutor should look into in deciding whether or not to invite a corporation to negotiate a remediation agreement. And this kind of national economic interest is explicitly prohibited in the code. But more than that, I think, as you suggest, it goes to the logic of when a remediation agreement would be appropriate. And to make it, to harness the best use of remediation agreements, it should not be afforded based on political considerations or the identity of the party, but whether or not the facts that are presented are those that would warrant a remediation agreement.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Ms. Acorn. Appreciate your insight today.
Great, thanks for having me.
As we reported earlier in the show, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, is watching the ongoing SNC-Lavalin case. The organization says it is concerned, quote, concerned about the allegations of political interference in the SNC-Lavalin criminal case. Here's how SNC-Lavalin got into legal trouble in the first place. It's alleged that between 2001 and 2011, SNC-Lavalin offered bribes to public officials in Libya worth $48 million. That included Saadi Gaddafi, son of the country's dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. SNC-Lavalin is accused of showering Saadi with a yacht, concerts, prostitutes, and lavish trips in order to secure lucrative government contracts. Later, when the Gaddafi regime was toppled, a consultant working for SNC-Lavalin was arrested in Mexico City, accused of trying to smuggle Saadi out of Libya. SNC-Lavalin also allegedly defrauded Libyan companies out of $130 million. In 2015, the RCMP charged the company with corruption and fraud. SNC-Lavalin has pleaded not guilty. If convicted, the company could be banned from bidding on any federal contracts for 10 years. And we are here with the Power Panel. I've got Brad Levine in Toronto joining me. I haven't memorized. I don't have the right the company that you're with, so apologies. Council of Public Affairs, I believe.
Council of Public Affairs.
Yes, thank you. Yolande James, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister, is in Montreal. Here with me in studio, former Director of Policy to Stephen Harper, Rachel Curran, now with Harper and Associates, and the CBC's own John Paul Tasker. Hi, everybody.
Hey,
nice to see you. Yolande, why don't I start with you? The OECD says that it's watching. It's watching what happens closely, and it's concerned. How significant is that?
Well, I mean, they can watch and be concerned. I would hope that the OECD will also watch and be concerned with a number of other remediation agreements that have been signed in the States or in Europe, elsewhere. I mean, when it comes down to is our own process, and I'm confident in the process that we have here. When I look at, for example, a company like Siemens back in 2008 got a remediation agreement to the point of $1.5 billion and is currently got the bid for the Via Rail contracts here in Canada. So I don't see why, in a case that Siemens, a German company, would be able to still get contracts, we would not consider the same thing for Canadian companies. And at the end of the day, what's really disheartening about this thing is that we don't go back to the heart of the debate of what the remediation agreements are supposed to be. That is, those that were mentioned in the report that you just made. It's not about letting those that are concerned or that are implicated in any corruption get off the hook. To the contrary, they're supposed to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But the idea is to make sure that the receptionist, for example, to the project manager that had nothing to do with this, does not have to pay the price of that. And that's what the heart of this is. But it seems like all that gets sidetracked with a direct attack on SNC-Lavalin, which I think is unfair.
Well, I think there's the reason for that is because the company has so closely been associated with lobbying for this type of remediation agreement to be included in law. Rachel, the OECD is interesting on this because they're the ones that highlighted in the first place back in 2011 that Canada had problems enforcing. That we have and they repeat in there we have good bribery laws and corruption laws in Canada. We have trouble enforcing them. A remediation agreement, the expert we had on just a few minutes ago said, is a good tool to increase that enforcement. The problem is with this part of it that's about national economic interests, and that is taken right from the OECD, like what you can and can't consider. And she said that the OECD is probably paying attention right now because they want to know if the stuff that wasn't supposed to be considered is actually what would be motivating the AG to intervene.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the issue, right? There's nothing wrong with the tool itself, and no one's quibbling with the existence of a DPA or a remediation agreement in the appropriate circumstances. The problem is here, the Director of Public Prosecutions decided after weighing all of these factors that SNC-Lavalin did not qualify under the existing legislation for one of these agreements. And we can speculate on the reasons for that, but keep in mind that these allegations dealing with Libyan contracts, one of which involved, by the way, building prisons for Mr. Gaddafi, to hold his political enemies in. Those were far from the only allegations against SNC-Lavalin. They have a fairly lengthy history of bribery and corruption, not just overseas, by the way, but in Canada as well, involving at least 2 major projects in Quebec. So, you know, again, speculating about the reasons why they did not qualify for an agreement, but that was probably one of the major factors that the Director of Public Prosecutions considered. And the issue then was that the government said, no, we're not going to accept that decision. We're not going to accept the decision of the Director of Public Prosecutions. We're not going to accept the agreement with that decision of the independent Attorney General, and we're going to pressure them to overturn it for political reasons. That's really the nub of this scandal.
The nub, though, according to the government, is it's not for everything up to for political reasons, right, Brad? I mean, they would say that those political reasons are not political, that in fact they're concerned, like any government should be, about the possibility, although there's no proof that all the jobs would disappear, but the possibility of those 9,000 Canadians losing their jobs. That's what they would probably say.
Well, that's what they're trying to say. And again, those 9,000, that 9,000 number, I think we're still trying to find out where it comes from, and is it legitimate? But the key with the OECD coming out today and the task force saying that they're watching and monitoring, I think there's 2 reasons why it's important. One is again, it takes it out of the domestic quarrel. And it puts it on a global scale. International organization is looking at it. We're one of 44 countries, 36 in the OECD, that have signed on to the anti-corruption and anti-bribery protocol. And 2 is it gives another timeline to all this. You know, I'm sure the Liberals are sitting around going, well, I hope that the break week kind of lets this die down a little bit, because there's a report that now that needs to come out in June for this OECD task force. This gives us another telephone pole on which to hang the next wire. The Justice Committee is going to meet again this Wednesday, and the beat will continue to go on. So this is not good news for the Liberals, who are hoping that this story would go away and stay as a domestic disagreement over certain facts.
And JP, we saw a letter just recently, Lisa Raitt wrote to Liberal MPs on the committee saying, like, this is another reason that you need to call back Jody Wilson-Raybould, because that's what they're going to be discussing on Wednesday.
Yeah, as we were talking about now, Lisa Raitt just sent out that email on Twitter. I don't think the federal Liberal government is all that worried about being found in contravention of the anti-bribery laws, but they're worried about it for this very reason, for the political consequences of it all, because then you have the likes of Lisa Raitt saying, this makes this whole Justice Committee process that much more serious, and we certainly have to hear from the Justice Minister again, especially after we heard from Jerry Butts. Right, especially after we heard from Jerry Butts last Wednesday, when he really, you know, a lot of Liberals I've spoken to, they thought he'd really hit it out of the park last week by poking some holes in her story, by questioning some of the timelines that she presented in her testimony. So the Liberals, of course, don't want to have her come back to committee. They're happy to leave it lie with Jerry Butts and his testimony and just keep it at a he said, she said. But with Lisa Raitt, you know, clamoring to keep this on the front burner by pointing to an OECD report like this, I think it gives it more weight. I think they have to take it more seriously now.
Yolande, what do you think should happen on Wednesday? Should they, given that they have heard from Michael Warnick a second time, that they have heard from Natalie Duran a second time, should the committee ask to hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould?
I mean, we have to be straight up with the fact that obviously the political parties, whether it's the government or the opposition, have a vested interest. I mean, it's not surprising that Lisa Raitt is insisting on the fact that any opportunity that she and other members of the opportunity are going to have to make this drag on longer, they're going to be able to do that. But the fact of the matter is, maybe she would have a point if people did not have the opportunity to hear Jody Wilson-Raybould, but they have. They've heard from her. They've heard from Jerry Butts. I don't know what's happening in the rest of Canada, but I could tell you there's certainly in Quebec and with all political strikes, there's starting to be a little bit of fatigue about hearing about it. Not that it's unimportant, not that people are not going to have a very divergent opinions on what's happened, but at some point in time, I mean, the soap opera has to end. And people will come and make a decision as to who they believe, and they'll decide, notably in the upcoming election, how the chips will fall.
Let's be fair here for a second, though. It's only the Liberals on the Justice Committee who don't want to invite Wilson-Raybould back. The other opposition members moved a motion.
The opposition
and the
members
Liberals
want to.
Yeah, no, but so the Justice Committee. But listen, you had Mr. Warnock twice. You had the Deputy Minister twice. And you had Mr. Butts to refute the evidence of Ms. Wilson-Raybould. Why is the Liberal majority on that committee so afraid to hear her side of the story so that we can close it? Because if the Liberals leave this open, then you're going to hand the opposition our ability to say this was a sham trial and we should have a public inquiry.
Brad,
we do. We need some kind of
I'll get Rachel Way in, and then I'll
this.
get you back, Yolande.
Yeah, here's where I agree with Yolande. We need some kind of proper resolution to this. And look, the Justice Committee is doing its thing, but it's not, clearly not a robust and independent process. It's a political one, and it's controlled by the Liberal members on that committee because they form a majority.
So what is the robust mechanism?
What we need is some kind of independent public inquiry into this to get to the bottom of it and to hear from all the people who need to be heard from and to sort through the evidence. That's not going to happen at the Justice Committee, so there needs to be another forum in which to do that.
What are the chances of that happening, JP, if the Liberal members of the committee don't even want to call Jody Wilson-Raybould back? Why? And though they haven't said they're for sure against it, but signs point that way. What is the likelihood of them entertaining the possibility of an inquiry?
If they're dead against it, they don't ever have to let it happen because they have a majority in the committee. They could also hear from her in another way. They don't necessarily have to hear from her in direct testimony at the committee itself. They could ask her some direct questions and get some written answers, especially on one important point, because the Prime Minister, when he waived solicitor-client privilege, when he waived cabinet confidentiality, he only did so relating to her time as Attorney General and Justice Minister. And of course,
there's a big month
didn't,
there where we don't know what happened.
It doesn't cover a really important part of this timeline, namely when she was shuffled to Veterans Affairs. And the main argument that she's making, and what the opposition is making, is that she was fired, right? She was moved because she refused to do this. Jerry Butts said that's not the case. Let's hear from her what exactly transpired after she was shuffled from the Attorney General's office.
Yolande, I said I'd let you weigh in one more time. Go for it. Final word to you.
No, I was just going to say that, I mean, it's no surprise to me. At this point, it's going to be, we didn't get to hear what she had to say from when after she was changed. And then if she was allowed to do that, then we didn't get to hear a conversation that she had with the members of caucus. So it'll just be, from the opposition's point of view, any opportunity that they have to drag it on, they will. And on the other side of the Liberal part, of course, they want to be able to put, the government wants to be able to put this to rest. But there's no other elements that have come to light in my point of view, in terms of the electorate's point of view, as to dig further. We have both narratives. We have both versions of what happened. Let people come draw their own conclusions. I think they're mature enough with everything that's been presented.